This is Thriving in Business and Life. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Welcome back to the program.
So, Will, last week we were exploring empowerment and how to go about that in a way that really, allows people to truly step into their power. When we've talked about empowerment before, we've always talked about the idea that empowerment is what happens when we see ourselves as fully responsible for how we show up. And then empowerment is what happens when in the behavior box. You could say, what do we do about it because we see ourselves as fully responsible?
Yeah, it's really a pretty straightforward formula. Empowerment is a behavior that results from a mindset of responsibility. And to try and produce empowerment without the mindset of responsibility, it's hard work and it doesn't really last.
Right, and one of the things we've talked about is that, if you really think about it in that way, then I can't empower anyone else.
Right.
I can create an environment that's conducive to them empowering themselves. It's always interesting when we might hear ourselves say, I empower you to do something. What we're basically saying is I'm allowing you or giving you the authority to. You may decide to do it or not. That's where the real empowerment comes from. Is your choice.
Well, and I think another subtext there is it's kind of a setup for blame.
Right.
Think about it.
Yeah.
I empower you to do this, which means, okay, it's your responsibility to do a good job here. And
You're
if
on
you
the
don't,
hook.
remember this moment when I said I empower you to do it.
Right. Well, one of the areas we've explored, we always talk about empowerment and that it is a combination of capability and, clarity. Am I sure what I'm supposed to do or what I'm asking you to do? And then the last piece that we really didn't touch last week, which kind of segues into our next topic as well, is the whole idea of commitment.
Right.
And, and what that leads to naturally is taking action.
Well, it does if it's real commitment. I think there's faux commitment, which may be described also as lip service. But the kind of commitment we're talking about is at a deep level. It's taking responsibility, it's feeling empowered, and kind of declaring it. I often think of the commitment part as, my declaration to myself that this is mine. I'm owning what I'm doing. I may be an employee in a large company, I may be one of thousands of people, but if I make that commitment, it's really claiming ownership for what I'm doing.
Right, and how one person shows up can impact the entire group. I mean, I've watched that, I'm sure you have as well, with clients of ours, how one person on a team or in a department can make such a huge difference based on how they start to show up because of their level of commitment.
Yeah, and this really is an aspect of what we call thriving leadership. The thriving leader creates a culture that inspires that kind of commitment.
Right.
They want their team members to be fully responsible, to feel empowered, and to make the kind of commitment that means they own what's going on.
Right, and one of the things we've always encouraged in the teams we work with is, yes, there's a formal leader, in some formal leadership position, but that each one of us, regardless of what formal role we're playing, have the opportunity to be a thriving leader. And as we've said many times, we'll do that successfully and sometimes wane when things get tough. If we're starting to create that culture, like you just said, what happens is if I start to slip, you remind me, and vice versa.
Right. It's a team game. Really, we're all on the same team. I don't know if you can remember this study. I read it in a leadership book many years ago about some consultant who his specialty was to go into a company and find out who the real leader was.
Interesting.
And it was rarely the CEO.
Right.
And this book is decades old now, but the principle was very interesting because in a lot of companies you found that the real leader was someone who didn't have much rank, but they were the person who everyone else felt they could talk to, they could kind of bare their soul, they felt understood, seen, heard. And his point was that every company has somebody like that, and you should find out who that is, even if it's the janitor, because that's a very important person. And then, obviously, the CEO needs to learn from that person. Why are they the leader and not me?
Well, I have seen that a lot, as you have, and interestingly, you mentioned, the janitorial position. I found that many times the person in that maintenance or custodial role is a wealth of information and can really tell you what's working and what's not and why, because they're in and amongst people in this informal way. Yeah. And I've found many times where the person that people talk to. Now, the other thing too, and we learned this early on in our consulting practice, to find out who was what we called the influential leader, or the informal leader. Right. Because, if the formal leader had an idea and that person wasn't on board, the informal leader, it wasn't going to happen.
Well, yeah, how many of us are familiar with the phrase something like, if you want it done, go talk to Betty. Because there's a Betty who can make things happen.
Right.
They often are not the acknowledged leader.
Well, so one of the things we would work with when we were dealing with a challenge with a team or a department was to find out who that informal leader was and talk to them, because first of all they would probably tell you why things weren't working and what the upset was and why they were in resistance. And so if we could work with them to try to find a common vision downstream that would benefit them and their cohorts and get their commitment, all of a sudden the ripple effect that would happen was pretty phenomenal, because you'd start to see this coalition of commitment form within the team, and suddenly what had been troublesome got accomplished in a very short period of time.
Well, I think what you're illuminating here is the significant difference between theory and practice. And one of the reasons why there's resistance to consultants, because they come in with theories. I still remember a story from another leadership book about an old board member in Ford who was sitting listening to this consultant who was recommending plant closures one after another. And finally he spoke up and said, well, why don't we just close all the plants? Then we'll really save money. So the point is that person, the influencer, the unacknowledged leader, is probably very street smart.
Right.
They've been there.
Yes.
They know how things really work.
Yeah.
And then you've got these people who know how they should work, or have been to university and have the degrees and their MBAs, etc., and are kind of going by the book. I think we miss a great opportunity in not marrying those two better than we could, because the street smart folks, they also have something to learn. All of us do.
Sure. Well, and that process of inclusion that we've talked about in past programs, if we're doing inclusion properly, we're making sure that we do get that kind of intelligence into the conversation, because commitment is contagious. And so is lack of commitment.
Yeah, no kidding.
There was a wonderful guy that I have had the chance to work with named Tom Feltenstein, and he was one of the key marketing execs at McDonald's and became an expert in chain restaurant marketing and profitability and so on. And one of the things he talked about was that he realized in his role as he was a consultant to different restaurant chains that the thing that could take a restaurant down quicker than anything else were some bad hires. When you hired people whose attitudes suffered, who weren't committed to the customer experience, they could bring the whole group down, because that lack of commitment was so contagious. And that he would go in sometimes to a place that was struggling, and he would see that what was happening was there were these two people, or sometimes even one person on the staff, who had this kind of negative attitude and this lack of real desire to create a great customer experience. And if there were good people on the team, they'd eventually leave because they couldn't tolerate that. Yeah. And yet, so we'd go to the owner of the franchise or the restaurant and say, why is this person still here? And it was kind of like, well, they've been here for such a long time. And it was kind of like, wait a minute, are you committed to your team and to your customers? Or are you committed to this person who's dragging you down?
Well, this harkens back to our basic principle of the thriving culture. And, they say one bad apple can ruin the whole basket. And I like the image of a glass of water where you put a drop of ink into that glass. And before long, the entire glass is polluted with the coloration from that one drop of ink. So it's tough, but often, a hard choice needs to be made about an influence in an organization that isn't productive for anybody.
Yeah, it's I don't know how it happened. Maybe it was because I was difficult as an employee early on in my career. But,
true confession.
Yeah, I have had a lot of clients who've had me get involved when they have a person who's a challenge.
Right.
And so I'll sit down with them and start to talk with them and say, do you realize what situation you're in right now? And metaphorically, point towards the exit and say, that's where you're headed. Are you aware of that?
Right.
And a couple of things were interesting. First of all, many times they weren't aware that other people were trying to figure out how to get them out the door. So nobody had really had a conversation with them. And so when they would learn that, sometimes they would be quite shocked. And I'd be, why do you think people might be perceiving you that way? What I found is that many people who were difficult weren't really trying to be difficult. They were the squeaky wheel that was getting no grease, right? In other words, they were pointing out things that were problematic that weren't being dealt with. And in a way, some of those people had once been phenomenally potential people.
Well, let's segue into what I think must be one of the greatest challenges for an organization and for entrepreneurs, and that's all the issues surrounding what is sometimes called founder's syndrome.
Right.
Where you've got an individual who's, been committed like up the wazoo. They've created something, and this something led to a company, and they have employees. They've got a whole empire in some cases that's been developed. And then it becomes obvious that they are now the problem. And we can think of many instances, I'm sure you've worked in companies where that's the case. I think it'd be a worthwhile exploration to talk about the different aspects of this where, commitment has got something going, built an enterprise. However, the one who had that original commitment is now become a problem child.
Well, either because they lost touch with the growth and the potential, or they maybe became bored or complacent, right? And this is always a tough thing to walk through with ourselves or others, is to look at the result and just make the assumption that the result is what I'm committed to. And, I look at that in different situations and go, ooh, ouch. Yep. That's what I'm committed to? Well, apparently, because it hasn't changed substantially enough, right? So whether that's in my personal life where I've got some ouches, or in a business setting, if I start to see the employees are becoming complacent and it's my company, well, that tells me that, apparently that's what I'm committed to, is having complacent employees.
Yeah, one of our business colleagues that we enjoy these Tuesday morning breakfast conversations with has been a business consultant for decades, and he told me about a situation just like this where a friend called him, desperate. His company was going down the toilet, a fairly large company, and he asked Dave if he would come in and have a look and give him some suggestions. So reluctantly, Dave did that because he sensed what a mess it was. But this was a good friend. So he did his analysis, and I'm shortening the story here. Dave spins it out. He said, okay, well, I'll help you out. I think we can turn this around, and I'm recommending you sell the company. And they were going bankrupt, so his friend thought it would be impossible to actually get it to the point of salability. So Dave made various suggestions about this and that, and he said, and here's the toughest one. You're fired. You
wow.
Can't go to work anymore.
Yeah.
And his friend said, what? He said, well, a lot of these problems relate to you. And I know it's not intentional, but we need to get you out of the way in order to get this finesse to the point where we can sell it. And they were successful, but this was a big ego hit for his friend who was so committed, had started this venture, but now was an obstacle.
You know, this is reminding me of a blog my son just wrote on Medium, if you know Medium Digest. Really profound blog about being overcommitted. Now, what he realized in this article was, he said, I became too committed to somebody else's business. He said, I started acting, being committed at the level as if I actually were an owner. And he said the challenge was, as he started to take that on, without the control you would have as an owner, he started, working longer hours and realized what was happening was his commitment to other things in his life, like his family, his creativity, his, physical well-being, were being compromised by his overcommitment to a job.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of a circumstance in my life exactly like that. I was collaborating with a friend, and we were building a venture together. It was supposed to be a non-profit endeavor. I learned later that there was an application in for a non-profit status, but it actually was a for-profit business. So there was a hidden agenda going on there. But I can remember a breakfast meeting where I had developed this overview of what my role could be and my commitment and how I would play a part. And as we were sitting there talking, we were in an outside table, a nice spring day, and I had this document ready to present. I realized that I was completely deluded as to what was actually going on, and I was way overcommitted, and it was dangerous. It was like I was out on a limb, and the limb was about to break. And I can remember that I had actually set this one-pager down on the table. It fell off the table onto the ground, and he put his foot on it.
Without even knowing
what he
was
doing. Without knowing
doing.
it, he's stomping on my proposal of my contribution. And I looked at this. I looked away from my coffee. I looked down, and I had this insight. This is a sign. The universe is telling me, don't do that. And so I leaned down, picked up the piece of paper, folded it, put it in my pocket, and the conversation went in a very different direction.
That's so interesting. Well, I think what I realized in reading my son Jesse's blog was that it's, when we commit to something, we uncommit, you could say, to something else in terms of at least time, right?
Yeah, if we say yes to one thing, we're saying no to something else. So and vice versa.
Yeah, so we go back to values. We've talked about that in earlier programs. Are my values aligned? And so, the question is, let's say I realize, okay, it's not my company, or it's not my organization, or not my project, but I'm showing up. How do I be committed and take action that's appropriate to the setting I'm in?
Well, let's drop this down even deeper here, because I think there's other levels of understanding and experience and then behavior relating to commitment. I think a lot of us get into trouble making commitments that are not really the kind of commitment we should be making. I just told that one story there, but if we just think of ourselves and ask the question, what am I actually committing to? Right? Because I think on one level it's okay, I'm committing to working in this company and doing my best. Fine. But I think there are deeper levels to that, and if we can go deeper in terms of our own lives and the trajectory of our development as a human being, and at the moment we have this job, I mean, in my dad's day, he had one job. These days, people have many jobs. So can we make a commitment that actually persists beyond various jobs and even possibly beyond various careers? You and I have had quite a number of reboots, different careers, but I would guess that underneath it, both of us have had a commitment to something deeper that persisted through all those changes.
Sure, and sometimes I wasn't sure what that was, but and sometimes the commitment at different stages is what feels like to survival. right?
Yeah.
So, being committed, and this was something, again, I was so, proud of my son for just the honesty with which he wrote this. He talked about the fact that because of him being overcommitted, he actually started to burn out.
Yeah.
And so he stopped showing up as the person who had originally helped start the company and stopped bringing the value that he could to the company and to his family and to himself. And so that whole deeper sense you're talking about is, what is the deeper level of commitment I have, and do I even know what it is?
Yeah, I mean, Shakespeare said, "To thine own self be true." And you can interpret that a number of ways. One is morally, ethically, but another level is to find out what it means to be true to yourself.
Right.
What's my life about? Why am I really here? These age-old questions. And it's so unfortunate that so many people in their lives get wrapped up in making a living that they're not really living. They're showing up, have a career, raise families, all very admirable. But on a deeper level, I mean, my mother was someone like this. Unfortunately, I was with her the last few days of her life. She died with a lot of regret because she had never really plumbed these deeper levels to find out, what is my life for other than being a good mother, which she was, good wife, a provider, etc., etc. She went to her deathbed with those questions unanswered.
Well, yeah, I think that's not at all uncommon. And, one of the challenges that we face in the current age we're in is that we're so inundated with choices and information and shoulds and expectations. And I know in a lot of the tech companies and other companies that are out there, the expectation now is that you are going to be working at least 10 hours a day. Right. If not more.
Yeah.
Now that tends to be more of a U.S. phenomenon. Other countries have somehow resisted to a degree that U.S. tendency. But as a result, our lives get out of balance.
Yeah.
And coming back and asking the question, what am I really committed to, is a ponderous, assignment.
Well, and it needs support. And I just want to acknowledge you because you've raised some children and they're doing very well. And going back to your son and his blog, I'd like to just ask a couple of questions about that. I mean, first off, how does it feel as a father to see your son having developed to the point where he's that aware and can be that conscious of himself and then write about it, which is going to help other people? That must be a wonderful feeling.
Oh, it is. I mean, I'm proud of him, and I think one of the things I realized was he learned some of that overcommitment from me.
Yeah,
he learned some of that, and I learned it from my dad. My dad was very much a workaholic, as was I. And there were great things I think that I was able to convey to my kids, but they suffered as a result of my overcommitment.
Well, so how did that chain get broken? Because evidently he's at least examining it consciously, and it's leading to some behavioral shifts. He's making a different kind of commitment. Because I'm sure there's listeners who are resonating with this going, oh, right, well, I get it. My hand's in the air. This is me. This is my son, too. How do you break the chain?
Well, for him, and I don't think it always has to be something like this, but he starts out, his blog was, "They fired me."
All right, well, don't try this at home. We're not recommending this strategy.
And then
but that's what happened to him.
Well, yeah, so he goes on to share how while he was there in a senior position, the company grew. I mean, they multiplied 30 times and 60 times their value and so on. So you could say on one hand, all this effort he put in grew this company in a tremendous way, but he so compromised himself that he ended up not being the person who'd originally come on board, and he no longer was bringing that value. So they went, you know what, we're making a decision. Somebody else is going to step into this role, and you're not, as we expand, I guess you could say he got laid off, but in reality, he could see, and it was such a hit to him. And as he took the time he had, he had some time accumulated so he could take time off before getting another job. he started to really reflect on what his life had become. And it had become way out of balance. And he wasn't showing up as the person that he really realized that he wanted to be, and at the deeper level really was.
Well, that's inspiring, because it's what we've been talking about here, having a deeper commitment, in this case to his life.
Yeah.
And learning lessons from what I'm sure was a tough experience, but could have been devastating without him having that deeper level activated.
Yeah, and it helped him really move into the next stage of his career with a company in a different role and with a different culture in the company and so on. And so, when we're talking about commitment and how it leads to action, it's really that question of regularly reflecting, I think, is on what am I committed to? To look at the result as the indicator of what I'm committed to, consciously or unconsciously. And then ask the question, is that okay with me? And if not, am I willing to do what it takes to change that? And sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is not yet, which is another way to say no. And sometimes it's a hard no. No, I'm not, and I'm never going to be.
Well, and all of this speaks to the value of awareness. And as we know, the overwork and tunnel vision and overcommitment is all the result of a certain seduction. We're addicted to something and can't see what's going on. And that's where pulling back a little bit to gain awareness, gain a perspective. I was sitting at that table, the paper fell on the ground, I pulled back to see it, and I could see much more than the paper. I saw the sign of what that meant. And I think that's a wonderful technique, if you will. That's probably not the best word for it, but just to pause, breathe, and gain perspective to expand awareness out of the seduction zone that may have me entranced in an experience that I'm overcommitted to, and I really need to adjust.
As you're saying that sense of being entranced by something, I think our ego gets easily entranced.
Yeah.
And I think, in my son's standpoint, he brought that up. Certainly for me, as I look back at the areas in my life where I overcommitted, I wouldn't have identified it at the time that it was my ego that was overcommitted. Yeah. But I look back at it now and go, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely it was. It was the shiny object that I became attracted to and sacrificed other things in that regard. So, yeah. It's what are we committed to, and you can take that into your personal life. You can take that up into our community, to the political scene, to your job. It's really a question that applies everywhere.
And it's wonderful to see what happens in any organization or in any family when this kind of balanced commitment is being revealed by even just one member.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'll share a quick story as we're wrapping up here. A tough one. My wife, when she was 6 years old, realized that there was some tremendous dysfunction in the family, and her way of expressing that as a 6-year-old was, I don't want to live here anymore. Because it was so dysfunctional. Now, unfortunately, her parents weren't equipped to really understand what that meant and how to deal with it. So their solution was they shipped her off to live in another place for a year.
Wow.
Instead of realizing that what she was trying to say was that, now for her, she was so committed to speaking up that even when they told her she was going to have to go somewhere else, she didn't give in, I mean, extraordinary for a 6-year-old kid to keep that level of commitment. But when we hear other people's voices speaking up and telling us something's amiss, are we committed to listen? And are we committed to do something about it? It's tough. I mean, these are things that I wrestle with regularly, because there's areas in my life where I realize, there's things that aren't what I would like them to be, but I struggle with, am I willing to do what it takes to get there?
Well, you're reminding me of a bizarre movie quote from Scarface, where a character says, I told you, but you wouldn't listen. Look at you now.
Yeah, well.
I'm not trying to do the Italian accent, but my brother can do a great job of that, and we often joke with that line, but it's actually quite profound.
Well, a lot we've covered here. So write us at thrivinginbusinessandlife@gmail.com. I'm Christopher Harding.
And I'm Will Wilkinson. Thanks for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.